let's start by using a little imagination game, okay? I want you to imagine that you are a lumberjack. That's a weird thing to imagine, isn't it? But imagine that you're a lumberjack and you have the same job that every lumberjack has always had in all of lumberjack time. Cut down trees, make logs, build fires, I guess, right? And you are a good lumberjack in that you're always trying to do what you do better. You're looking for new ways to get the job done more efficiently, more effectively, always trying to improve. And one day you're walking through the woods and you stumble across something that you've never seen before. You've seen things like it, but you've never seen one like this. And you pick it up and you start to realize this could change everything. You understand that this is a saw. It's got teeth and it looks just like some that you've used before, but there's more teeth. So you decide that you're going to start using this saw to cut down trees and make logs and do what lumberjacks do. And it works really good when you're pulling. But for whatever reason, when you push on it, it wants to bow and jam up and lock up. And so you're frustrated at times, but everybody else is watching and they're kind of going, this seems like a good idea, maybe we'll use some too. And it's the same deal. When you pull on it, it seems to work, but when you push, there's trouble. And one day, in the same woods in which you work, a bunch of people in white lab coats come to town. And they start watching what you're doing, and they say, can we point something out to you? We've been watching and observing, and we think we've noticed something that would be really important and help you do your job even better. Have you noticed that there's a handle on that end too? You see, what we've deduced is that this saw was not designed to be used by one person. It's actually designed to be used by two. And so when you pull and get it to this end, another person stands on that end and pulls it that way. And you're going, what kind of lumberjack am I? I should have known that. But you realize quickly, this is a better way to use this thing because it's being used according to its design. And this morning, what I want you to get stuck in your head and never forget is that this saw is your brain. The truth about your brain is that it was not designed to be used in solitary. It was to be used in conjunction with someone else. You see, the problem is you and I spend so much of our time thinking alone, and we end up getting frustrated because we're not always sure what we're thinking means. We're not always sure how we're supposed to apply it, what we're supposed to do with it. And what I want to do today is come alongside and say there's a handle on the other end, and if we were to come together and think together, we might come up with and learn some things and see some things and grow in some ways that we didn't know was possible. Because what I've been toying with is this reality that we rarely say, we didn't think that through. Have you ever noticed that? I say I didn't think that through all the time. I usually say it to my wife. I didn't think that through. I'm really sorry that that's on fire right now, or it doesn't work any longer. I didn't think that through. But I can count on one hand and not even use all my fingers the amount of times that I've said we didn't think that through. Because often the things that I miss, someone else picks up. Or the things that I get stuck on and think are the most important thing, someone else might come along and help me see it differently. Because my brain was not designed to be used by itself. And no matter where you go in Scripture, you find people thinking together. And here's why this is so important. Not just because we're in a series about togetherness and community and the power of with. It's because the Bible says things like, you are to be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And then Jesus said, you're to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. There's something to our brain being transformed, renewed, committed, all of those things. Thinking is a part of following Jesus. And what we've discovered is that thinking is done best with others. And there's no better example than this, than Paul himself. If you want to turn in your Bible to the book of Acts, we've been there a lot lately, but it gives us such a good glimpse into the community of the church in the first century. And so what we're going to look at today is Paul as he heads out onto yet another missionary journey where he's going around helping plant churches, teaching people who Jesus is and how he connects to the Old Testament. But I've noticed, and you will notice, and you've probably already known this because you're really smart, that Paul does it in a very interesting and repeatable way. So Acts chapter 17 this morning is where we're going to start. And we're going to start right in verse 1, which reads like this. Paul and Silas then traveled through the towns of that town and came to Thessalonica, where there was a Jewish synagogue. Now here's what's so interesting to me. It doesn't say Paul went to those places. It says that Paul always had a plus one. And sometimes it was Barnabas, sometimes it was a guy named Mark, Luke was along for the ride a lot of the times, but in this case, we're talking about a man named Silas. It's and Silas, Paul and Silas, and I think this is really, really important because Silas did not write any of the letters that you find in your New Testament. Not one. He didn't write any of the books of the Bible. In fact, most of the time, if not all the time that you hear about Silas, it's just that he's with Paul. But this is really important for you and I to remember that Paul never traveled alone. Now, you ask yourself, why? I mean, Paul had the privilege of Jesus himself meeting him on the Damascus Road and commissioning him to reach the Gentiles and all the non-Jews in that known world for Jesus. Why does Paul need somebody with him? I think it's for three reasons in particular. Number one, he needs him for accountability. Paul is preaching a really good game. And Silas is there to help him practice what he preaches. Silas is there to help him when temptation comes his way because Paul is just like the rest of us and he's not immune to temptation. So Silas is there to kind of walk alongside of him and hold him accountable. I think it's also just for the simplicity of companionship. Think about the things you do in your life every day, even the mundane things. It's more fun when there's someone there with you. It's more fun for me to wash dishes when there's someone there with me. It's more fun to work out in the yard when someone's there with me, right? It's more fun, it's better, it's more fruitful when someone else is along for the journey because there's something about us that doesn't ever want to go it alone. So Paul has Silas come along with him for companionship. And then finally, I think it's just for encouragement. And you do remember Paul had rocks thrown at him on several occasions. He was shipwrecked a couple times. He was ran out of town, countless, left for dead. I mean, Paul wasn't exactly everybody's favorite person. And even though a lot of people came to Jesus through him, there were a lot of other people that really despised him. And so I imagine it would be easy to become discouraged and depressed and feeling pretty lonely. And so Silas being along with him gives him the ability to be seeing things from a different angle. Silas comes along and encourages him. Paul, God's doing big things. Jesus is up to something and he's using you. He's working through you. It's so important that there's someone with us because Paul, in order to do what Paul did, in order to do what Paul does, his head has to be right. Because all of our action and all of our stuff comes from our brain. Our brain is the central operating system for all of our bodies and all of those kinds of things. And so if Paul's head isn't right, then his ministry is not going to be right. And so God gives him a companion in Silas. You see, the truth is, we think better together. We think better together. Our brains function better, we do better, our heads are more right when we are not alone. We miss more in solitary thinking than when we do it communally. It's just fact. And even though Paul's one of the greatest teachers to ever walk the face of the earth, he's not immune to the human side of all of us that just needs someone to be along for the ride. There's power in the word with. This isn't the end of the story. Silas is along on the journey, and then we pick it up in verse 2. As was Paul's custom, he went to the synagogue service. And for 3 Sabbaths in a row, he used the scriptures to reason with the people. Now, if you read about every stop on Paul's journeys, you're going to see the same thing. He rides with somebody, and his first stop is always the synagogue. He starts with the Jews, and he begins to discuss with them. And what Luke says is he uses very specific wording. He says he went to reason with them. I can't help but point out, it doesn't say that Paul went to the synagogue to preach at them, or to teach them, or even to just throw Bibles at them. Paul shows up in the synagogue to reason with those people. So I imagine there's probably some time where Paul is teaching, but then there's also other time where Paul is discussing. People are coming up and they're asking questions and they're going back and forth, and there's dialogue about this because they are thinking about what he's teaching. Now, what I want to do is just take a minute and kind of differentiate some terms that will often get thrown around when it comes to how our brains work, specifically how our brains work in community. Let's start with the word think. Everybody in this room has the capacity to think. You've been thinking since the moment you woke up. In fact, you've probably been thinking since you fell asleep. You are constantly thinking, and all thinking is to have a particular opinion, belief, or idea about someone or something. This is easy, right? Everybody does this. We form opinions all the time about things and people. You are walking around with countless opinions, countless thoughts in your brain right now. You're thinking something about my outfit. You're thinking something about the passage we're looking at. You're thinking about what you're going to eat after church, right? Like we are always thinking. It's just always happening. And that's not what Paul did. He didn't go to the synagogue to just think with people. He went to reason with them. Now, reason is a completely different idea. It has to do with thinking, but it's kind of next level thinking. Reason is to think, understand, and form judgments by a process of logic. It's very determined thinking. It's thinking according to some rules. It's using logic to make not just an opinion, but to have a judgment, a conclusion about something that's being discussed. And I find it so fascinating that Paul goes to the synagogue to reason with people. Not just think. Not just get them walking out chewing on something else, but to actually help them understand and form judgments by a process of logic. This is what makes Paul so good at what he did. He didn't just throw a bunch of crazy ideas out there. He threw ideas out there that made sense. And he helped people walk through them. And you're going to see how he did that in just a minute. But I want to take it even one step further to help us see what Paul is getting at, because it was actually Paul who said that you should be transformed by the renewing of your mind. He said that in his letter to Rome, the Christians in Rome. And what Paul starts to do every time in every town as he reasons with people is he's trying to change their intellect. And what he starts to do is dispel the myth that Christianity is not a thinking person's game. Because intellect is the faculty of reasoning and understanding objectively. See, we talk about intellectuals. We'll label that, give that label to people who read a lot. I don't understand that. Intellectual and reading are not one and the same, right? But that's what we do. That's what I did in college. Well, they're an intellectual. They just love reading these big, thick books. No, being an intellectual means that you have the ability to reason and understand something objectively. And here's why that's important, because everybody comes to the table, everybody comes to the synagogue emotionally charged up about what they believe and what they don't believe. And they have opinions because they're thinking. But what Paul's going to do in reasoning with them is he's going to help build some structure around that so that they can come to some objective conclusions that might fly in the face of what they feel. Because Paul understands that the way that we are transformed is when we begin to change the way we think. But none of this happens if Paul and Silas don't get with the people in the synagogue. Because we think better together. We're better together, period. But we will always think more clearly, more soundly, more objectively when we're doing it with other people. Now, here's how Paul did it. He comes into the synagogue and he starts to explain some things, again, in a reasonable kind of way. Next verse, verse 3, goes like this. He explained the prophecies and proved that the Messiah must suffer and rise from the dead. He said, "This Jesus I'm telling you about is the Messiah." Some of the Jews who listened were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, along with many God-fearing Greek men and quite a few prominent women. Now, I want to pause here because it's really important for you to see that Paul is using the Old Testament. So for anybody that would come along and say the Old Testament doesn't matter to what we believe today is wrong. Because Paul's example is tie it to the prophecy. Because one of the things that makes Jesus so incredible is that he fulfills all of these prophecies, more than 300 of them, that we hear about in the Old Testament. And this is important because the people that he's talking to, especially in that day and age, they only knew the Old Testament. They didn't call it that. They called it the Jewish Scriptures. And so when Paul can tie Jesus to that, he begins to build a bridge, and you can see he's appealing to their thinking. And he's doing it reasonably. Now here's what's interesting. Just because Paul's really good at what he does doesn't mean everybody's going to pay attention. It says that some of the Jews listened. Some of them were willing to pay attention, maybe be open-minded about what Paul had to say. And what's interesting is that the ones that listened, it says, were persuaded. And that only means one thing. They disagreed initially. If you're persuaded of something, it means that they started going, this guy's full of it. But as he appealed to their reason and to their intellect, they started to go, this makes sense. And even though I don't want to believe it, I can't not believe it because it's logical and it's objective. And it is hard to argue with those things. And it says, because they were persuaded, their minds were literally changed, they joined with Paul and Silas. But it wasn't 100% of the people. There was a whole nother percentage that thought differently. And it's bigger than they just didn't agree with Paul. It actually gives a totally different word in the very next verse. But some of the Jews were jealous. So they gathered some troublemakers from the marketplace to form a mob and start a riot. I think it's interesting that some listened and some were jealous. And we could spend an entire sermon together talking about why they were jealous. But what I want to point out to you is that the jealous ones, the ones that in the end didn't agree with Paul and thought he was wrong, they did some gathering. It says that they gathered. They went and found other people, what Luke calls troublemakers, to come together and gather around them. Why? Because we don't ever want to be alone. We never want to be the minority. So if someone's teaching something and we don't agree with it, the first thing we think to do every time is to find someone who agrees with us. Because we don't want to be alone. And if we can find a bunch of other people that will tell us we're right and they're wrong, we feel better. This is a psychological process called confirmation bias. You can read about this in any psychological magazine. It is who we are to a T. Let me explain. Here's what confirmation bias is. We all come to the table every single day with things that we already believe to be true. And what we will do all day, every day, is find things that confirm that bias. Now, somebody else might see it differently, but you're going to see it and you're going to see, I knew I was right. Some of us do this while we're driving. Some of us do this while we're waiting in line. We do this all the time. That proves my point. And so I'm drawn to these things, and we do this with people. They prove my point. And I don't have to feel alone, and if I'm not alone, then I can't be wrong. I must be right. This is how confirmation bias works, and we all do it. Let me give you an example. Think back to the last time you wanted to spend a lot of money on something. For some of you, it was a new truck. For others of you, it was a new outfit or a new house or a fancy vacation. And you did what good thinking people do. You sat down with a sheet of paper and a pen and you started writing out a pro-con list. Because that's what your first grade teacher taught you to do, right? You sit down, you start making a pro-con list. I'm going to make a bold prediction. You did not have any trouble filling this side of the paper. You thought of hundreds of pros. No problem. But then your spouse comes along, and you're sitting there going, I can't miss. Look, there's no cons. Then your spouse comes along, and they're like, I got a few for you. Why? Because they aren't biased towards what you want to do. They're biased towards what they want to do. And we all do this. You will never have trouble proving your own opinion. And why it's so challenging when we get together with other people is because they make us see the other side. This is the nature of the saw analogy. One side is the pro, one side is the con. And the best way to come to the best conclusions is when they work together. You see, in most circles that I've been a part of, we look at confirmation bias as a bad thing. And it is a bad thing if it's isolated. It's not a bad thing if confirmation bias happens in the context of community. Because I'm going to get on this end of the saw with my biases. A friend is going to get on the other end of the saw with their biases. They're going to fill in my gaps. I'm going to fill in their gaps. And what is going to happen in the end? This log will be cut in half. It's just the nature of how it works. And this is why width is so important, because you and I spend so much time thinking by ourselves. And we grab this saw and we get frustrated. But here's what's true about the saw. Your body has a natural bias built in. All of us, 100% of us, are stronger in the pulling stroke. You can get more momentum and more strength and more torque pulling than you can pushing. That's not a bad thing if you put someone else on the other end that does the same. They have a bias too, and they're pulling. And in the context of a loving community and relationship, good things result. You see, sometimes we think the best way for us to feel good in life and to think straight and all those kinds of things is just to get people that agree with us. That's not how it worked for Paul. He was constantly with people who disagreed. And the people that disagreed and were jealous and all of that, they decided we all want to be on the same side of the saw. We don't want to listen to him. In fact, they started to get mad, so mad that some of Paul's friends came along and said, dude, you got to get out of here. You need to run to Berea because it's safer there. And so you jump down to verse 10. This is what we read that happens next in Paul's journey. That very night, the believers sent Paul and Silas to Berea. When they arrived there, they went to, guess where? The Jewish synagogue. That's where Paul always goes. I imagine they're rolling into town, and Silas says, let me guess, Paul, we're going to the synagogue first thing. We can't even get to the hotel first? This is what Paul does, right? And the people of Berea were more open-minded than those in Thessalonica, and they listened eagerly to Paul's message. I want to point something out, because this word, being open-minded, is kind of a buzzword these days. Everybody should be open-minded, and I agree. We need to be open-minded, but we should not equate being open-minded with being thoughtless. We should not equate being open-minded with not being reasonable and thinking things through with other people. So I agree, we should be open-minded, because there's this old grandma and grandpa saying out there that goes like this: you can't read the label of the jar you're stuck inside. You ever thought about that? You can't. You can't read the label of the jar you're stuck inside. We need to think outside the box a little bit more often. We need to be open-minded and allow ourselves to be challenged. Because some of the things that have grown me, this is for the Christians in the room, some of the things that have grown me most in my faith are my discussions with people who think I'm crazy. Some of the moments where I've really deepened in my relationship with Jesus are the moments where someone who doesn't believe God exists and I have a loving, good conversation over a cup of coffee. And I want to believe, and I do believe, that they'd say the same. They maybe thought about Christianity differently, because I didn't yell, scream, storm off, but I listened. I was willing to be open-minded, but I applied thinking and reason and intellect to the equation. Here's what's interesting. The people that were open-minded, and for some of us in the room, we're doing this church thing because we just want to make mom happy, and they promise us free lunch afterwards, right? Some of us, we do this because our neighbor invited us, and we just didn't feel okay saying no. Some of you need to be open-minded too. And maybe consider the fact that Jesus is exactly who he said he is. Because the result of this in Berea is the same result in Thessalonica. The people that listened and were open-minded and willing to entertain the idea that Jesus might be the Messiah, it's the same result. Listen to verse 12. They searched, well, first before we get there, there's something really cool that happens. This is what Bereans are known for, by the way. They searched the scriptures day after day to see if Paul and Silas were teaching the truth. And I read that and go, aren't you a little concerned about making Paul mad? You're checking his math? I mean, this is like the Christian preacher guy coming to your town, and he's going to get up there and present the gospel and connect it to the Old Testament, and you're going to check his math? What's cool, though, is Paul doesn't get up and go, how dare you? I think Paul cheers it on. You know why? Because Paul knows the truth. So go ahead, you look. You'll find that I'm not making this up. I'm not being silly. I love that the Bereans decide we're going to see if Paul and Silas are telling the truth. What this means is they are thinking for themselves. So can I encourage you with an idea? Never, ever, ever blindly believe everything I say. Don't. You go get your own Bible, you read it, and you make sure I'm not making this up. Please. I will not be offended. I will not say, how dare you. I would welcome, let's sit down and let's talk about it. Not because I think I'm going to prove you wrong, but you might prove me wrong, and I need that. So don't, with anybody, don't just blindly believe anything some preacher says. Because if the Bereans didn't just blindly believe Paul, who's any other preacher today? Think for yourself. Have some dialogue. Get together with some other people. Because what the Bereans were not satisfied with was just simply interacting. Right? This is going to church. The Bereans were not satisfied with just going to church. You show up every week, I show up every week, and we interact. I talk a little bit, you maybe laugh at a stupid joke I tell, you nod along, we might bump into each other in the hallway, we interact. You interact with each other. And then we go home and get along on our merry way. Maybe there's a good golf tournament on today. But the Bereans say, no. This is about our life, not just church. And we don't want to just go to church, we want to grow in church. And so they push the envelope and move beyond interacting to what I'm going to call interthinking. They're going to come back. They're going to see if Paul's telling the truth, and I can guarantee you along the way they're going to go, but what about this, Paul? And they'll have a discussion. Or they're going to go to another Berean in their community group, because we're assuming they had community groups, and they're going to say, what did you think about what Paul said? Because I'm seeing this, I'm not sure. And they're going to have a discussion. They're going to trade thoughts, and they're going to reason together because that's the example that Paul gave them. And now the result is always the same. Verse 12, or verse 11, the end of this passage. As a result, many Jews believed, as did many of the prominent Greek women and men. This sounds just like what happened up in verse 5. But it didn't just happen because Paul did a great sermon. It happened because there was thinking going on, there was reasoning going on. And we think better together. It didn't say one Berean went and checked Paul. It said they went and checked Paul. They got together. They looked at it for themselves and thought about it for themselves. The exchange of thinking and having conversation and dialogue and, dare I say, argument is the best way for us to grow when we do it together. And this isn't just good Christian talk. This isn't just warm, fuzzy, hey, we're doing life together. For me, this is getting backed by science. Our brain's not meant to work alone. So we need to couple it with someone else's brain, interthink together, and we grow closer to Jesus. Now, for some of us, the community group idea is a new thing. This getting together over coffee even and talking about where we're at in our faith and what we're learning, that's all a new thing. I want to help you think about how to enter into this if you've never entered into it before. And for those of us who are here this morning, we're going, I do community all the time. I can't get these people out of my house. I think there's some good things to be conscious of as community groups start to kick back up. We are all in need, myself included, of an attitude adjustment. Now, whenever we think about attitude, we usually jump to negative attitude, like we gave someone attitude. And that's not what I'm meaning. I think attitude is comprised of 4 key components. And if we can adjust each of those components, I think we're well on our way to being in a situation where there's good push and pull, good conversation, great thinking, and a lot of growing. The first component is this, the effective part of who we are. The effective part of who you are is your feelings. And some of us need to adjust how we feel. Not change how we feel, but adjust how we go about feeling. Because a lot of us lead with our feeling. A lot of us can't get past our feeling. A lot of us lock onto our feeling, and we hold there. And what we need to be willing to do is unlock a little bit of how we feel, be open to changing it, not jumping to the same place every single time. The second part is the cognitive part of who we are. This is our thinking. And this has been the subject of the whole day, but it's a key part of our attitude. The thoughts that run through your head, the opinions and all of those things, they form you because your brain helps form you. So we need to consciously work on our thinking. Again, if Paul says you're transformed by the renewing of your mind, Jesus says love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. This is a big deal. The third is a new one to me. It's cognitive, the cognitive part of who we are. This has to do with our actions, what we do. Because again, for a long time, we've built this life in a certain structure and we do things in a certain way, and oftentimes it doesn't leave a lot of room for this. We assume the saw has to be used in one singular way. That's what we've always done. But maybe, just maybe, there's a better way. And so we need to be open to changing how we do things. Finally, and this is really, really important, finally is the evaluative part of who we are. This is our response to positive or negative stimuli in our life. Because if you're anything like me, sometimes my knee-jerk reaction is I just get mad. If I'm sad, I get mad. If I'm happy, I get mad. It's like, especially for guys, like our response to everything is we're just going to get angry because it's scary and it's loud and it's secondary. Anger is always a secondary emotion. And maybe we're not responding in a way that's cultivating this kind of community. Maybe in the community group that you've been a part of for so long, there hasn't been any attention to how we respond to each other, especially when each other differs from us. They have a different opinion, a different view. How do we respond to that? We have to be conscious of these things. Because here's what's interesting about Paul's little journey that we looked at today. Paul's method never changed. What Paul was teaching never changed. The only variable in every part of the equation is the people and how they responded. Did you notice that? Paul does it the same. Some people listened, some people got jealous. Some people were closed-minded, others were open-minded. Some people just assumed he was all wrong, other people dug into it for themselves. And so part of what is so important for you and I is to stop trying to get everybody else to change them and think that they're the problem and start going, maybe I need to adjust my attitude and how I interact with people and relate to people and build relationships in the context of community. And there's no better place to do that than in that context. I think we think, I got to get this right, and then I'll join a group. No, join a group. They'll let you practice. They will. And so today, I couldn't think of a more practical application than you walking out of here and exploring what it would look like to be a part of a community group today. Paul never went anywhere by himself. Why are you? Every church he ever worked with was a community that would come together and reason together. Why aren't we? So I dare you to walk out into the foyer today and just talk to some people that are out there. We have all kinds of different groups here for you. Some of them are just going to be about, we want to talk about the sermon and Josh's outfit over some lunch. That'd be good. Others are going to go, we want to dig deep, which is why we, more than ever before, offer study groups, which is a certain kind of community group. Some of us want to really dig deep into the Bible, and I think we all should. And so we've got study groups available where you can come together for 8 to 10 weeks and you can really dive deep into the scriptures and explore what Jesus, what God, what all of the biblical writers said on God's behalf and dig deep. But don't walk out of here today going, that all sounds good, and someday I'm going to surround myself with some other people so I can think better. Experience the power of with today. Because life together helps us think better. We just think better. What I can promise you in the context of a community group, and there are people all over this room that will testify to this reality, you will grow spiritually in community. You will discover things that you didn't know were there, that you didn't know you could find. And you're going to think about your faith more often and more deeply because you have accountability, companionship, and encouragement as you journey. There's power in the word with. Don't miss it. Will you pray with me? God, as we get ready to head off into our weeks, some of us are blessed to have family and friends and small groups that are part of our life, and we understand innately the power of not going about life by ourselves. Others of us are a little nervous and scared and overwhelmed by the prospect of Christianity having anything to do with community. But Lord, you've called us and given us example after example in your word about doing life together, doing Christianity together, because following you at times, Lord, is challenging and confusing and hard. So we need people alongside of us to help us along the way. So Lord, for those of us that are in that place, give us courage, keep us, I guess, from even getting in the car today before we've at least talked to somebody about what it would look like for us to be a part of a community this year. Lord, thanks for Paul and his example. Thanks for Silas and the community that he provided Paul. Thanks for the Bereans and the Thessalonians and all those people that help us understand better how you've wired us and how you've asked us and invited us to walk with you. We love you with all our hearts. Thank you so much for all you do for us. You are a good, good Father. In Jesus' name, amen.